Today on Law Weekly, we look at issues of security, the AFTA agreement, and some of the challenges facing the legal profession. We talk to a senior legal practitioner, Gbenga Oyebode. We also have some other senior lawyers set an agenda for the Chief Justice of Nigeria, plus a weekly recap of some of the important stories from the courtrooms. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Shola Shuyeli. Nigeria still grapples with serious issues of insecurity. As with every other citizen, it's an issue that constantly agitates the minds of professionals, including legal practitioners. And so when I got an opportunity to interview a former chairman of the Nigerian Bar Association section on business law, Mr. Gbenga Oyebode, I began by asking his thoughts about some of the implications of the security challenges, especially on the economy.
I think the issue of insecurity is one that is a present danger to all of us. I think it's something that I don't think there's any Nigerian who will say to you that a member of his family has not been touched by an event or an instance, something that's made them fear for their lives in the recent past. But I think it's also important to balance that against certain other things that are happening around us. I think it's important to say, when you say there's insecurity and we focus only on insecurity, but we don't look at what are the causes of insecurity. My view is that if you don't focus on growth in the economy around you, and 50% of your population is under 35, then what you're dealing with is a situation where there's a time bomb that's coming. It's actually not just coming, it's actually here already. In approximately 25 years' time, you're going to have a situation on your hands where there are 400 million people. The city of Lagos is going to be 40 million people. How do we deal with that population growth? Nigerians tend to be happy when we say that we'll be the third biggest country in the world in 20 years' time. But we tend not to see that to the benefit, if there's a benefit at all, is a burden. The burden is that we must create jobs, we must create opportunity for the youths in our society. And I believe, my view is that that is what is causing, as a cause for some of the insecurity you see today. A lack of jobs, a lack of prospects, essentially a lack of hope. So I'd like to turn it on its head and say, don't just focus on insecurity by saying we're deploying police and soldiers around the country. Let's focus on insecurity by saying, how do we cure the cause of it? How do we create an opportunity for people? How do we create hope for our youths that today have no jobs? And I think that if we balance those two things, we essentially will be able to create what I like to think of as a fairer population. Let's focus on income inequality and educational inequity. If we solve some of those problems, I tend to think that the future will be bright. But right now, we're not focusing on it. We all tend to think that it doesn't matter what happens to the economy. We're all focused on the society should be secure. But these things go hand in hand.
Specifically, as a way of addressing the issues, what do you think must be done first?
For the future, I think we need to understand that we live in a global world. What are the essentials of a global world when it comes to job creation? It is by having a robust private sector. What does the private sector do? The private sector tends to create jobs. How does the private sector create jobs? Because it's a level playing field. And why is that important? It's important because when foreign investors look at Nigeria, every time they look at companies that have incorporated in Nigeria, if they think that they are not being treated fairly, let's take a look at the oil industry. For every time that we think that there was no cause and effect with respect to the fact that we couldn't get total crude oil production in Nigeria up, it was because investors went elsewhere, where life is easy, where it's not so difficult to operate, where government doesn't come back to rewrite the rules of the game after you signed an agreement. I think we need to focus on the fact that government and the private sector should join hands to create an environment that will make our economy grow. A 3% GDP growth or a 2% GDP growth when population growth is 3%, it makes no sense. If we are committed to making sure that 100 million of our people are brought out of poverty, then that means our growth will be at least 7 to 10%. There are things that you do to get growth to 7 to 10%. And by the way, we're not doing them. So it's important that the rhetoric is matched by the action. And I think there are a couple of gaps today. We just need to see government committed to a level playing field, to consistency in government policy, to making sure that the private sector is encouraged as opposed to discouraged. And I think if those things happen, you will see the private sector respond.
Nigeria recently signed the African Continental Free Trade AfTA Agreement. How do you think that the country can best maximize the opportunities that come with signing that document?
It's one thing to sign the treaty. I think the next most important step is to domesticate it in our laws. So it is, I don't want to say it's typical around here, but there are many treaties that Nigeria is a signatory to that haven't been domesticated, where sometimes it takes a little bit longer for it to happen. I think what, again, we need to understand, the world is a global village. In the world today where technology drives growth, in a world where I don't need to be in New York to know what's happening in New York or to be made to even feel like as if I'm there. I think we need to take a look at the continent and say to ourselves, as the biggest economy on the continent, we should not be afraid of trade. And trade isn't about being protectionist. We need to understand that even if we are protectionist, the rest of the world or the rest of the continent is going to move ahead and operate without us. I think that those things are clear. Look, it took us some time to sign. I think that it may have been entirely conceivable that government was a bit unsure of the benefits. I think that it's a good thing that the president, after the engagements that took place at very high levels, committed Nigeria on a path of growth. I see the free trade agreement as a growth initiative, and to that extent, competition, whether it is in agricultural goods or it's in manufacturing, is a good thing. Nigeria is not an island. We have borders with countries around us who have signed on to this agreement. We have borders with people who essentially have traded with us for centuries. What this agreement tends to do is to confirm the existence of trade. Whether we capture it in our books as legal trade or not, it happens. So my view, let's domesticate the law in our books. Let's make sure that our manufacturers understand that they compete. They compete with everybody else in the world. So it's not about producing in Nigeria at prices that you cannot justify, making sure that the Nigerian population pays higher goods for services and goods, higher than even their neighbors. That makes no sense and will forever drive poverty in our country.
So when you say domesticated, who's responsible for driving that?
Well, essentially the Nigerian government needs to make sure that the National Assembly passes the law so that it becomes part of our law, at which point you would then be able to essentially behave true to type. Right now, the very fact that the agreement has been signed is the first step. The next step is to make sure that it becomes the law, part of the laws of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
You talk about globalization and technology. How ready will you say Nigerian lawyers are for these changes?
That's part of why the theme of our conference, the NBA annual general meeting this year, is around facing the future. We do need to make the Nigerian lawyers understand that, again, we're not an island, that we must compete, that there are changes that are taking place around the world that inevitably we will be part of, that we can gain from the knowledge, that we can gain from the way we train our lawyers, that we can make them more savvy, more worldly, more aware of technology and the benefits of it. And so that when you see the theme that says facing the future, it's really about understanding that the future, by the way, is bright. But you must even first conceive it such that you can then actualize it. You'd wonder why should we have a Nigerian Bar Association conference that's talking about space law? Because you know what? Nigeria has a satellite up there. We do need to understand what are the issues around this. How can we better manage the resources? Why should we let other people do things for us? There needs to be an understanding of the things that are happening around us so that we don't get left behind. And I think that the Nigerian Bar Association is properly placed to make sure that our lawyers see themselves as part of this world. We're looking at reform. Look, we still have laws on our books that were old English laws that the English have repealed and reviewed several times over. I think that the work of the Nigerian Law Reform Commission hasn't been done yet. I think we need to understand that the reform of our laws across the board is a continuing exercise. And so we may not be ready. Look, I'll give you an example. There are not very many Commonwealth or common law jurisdictions left in the world where people still dress like as if they were in England of 200 years ago. That in itself is part of progress. The fact that people change. The only certainty in life is change. So part of that reform that some of us are looking for is reforming how do we train our lawyers? What do we train them in? How do we make them more effective? And how do we make sure that they are able to provide to their clients the very best of the legal education that we give them? So even if those are some of the quick wins, I think that we will be able to make sure that the Nigerian lawyer is as good as you want him to be. And more importantly, ready for the challenges of the future.
Transparency International recently came out to say that the judiciary is one of the most corrupt institutions in the country. So what do you think that the CJN can do to improve the perception that the judiciary is corrupt?
Look, I think that it's important that you look at how institutions, let me first talk generally about institutions. How do institutions set the tone? They tend to set the tone from the top. I think that the CJN actually has his work cut out for him, in the sense that whether perception is true or false, it is perception. And to the extent that we live in a society where the cost of justice is high, the ability of our people to get justice is becoming difficult. And so the tone has to be set from the top as to justice reform. Has to be set around the criminal justice reform, the ability of people to afford the process. And I think more importantly, even around the training of judges. I think one of the things that we tend not to also focus on is even how do we appoint our judges. Across the board in Nigeria, we've tended to appoint people into public service based on federal character. We tend to promote people sometimes way beyond their knowledge. I think it's important that we understand that sometimes if you don't do meritocracy, you're going to get what you deserve. You get what you deserve because the judge that's sitting there making these decisions may not actually have a total understanding of subject matter and of the realities. So I think it's important that the signal that we send or the signal that the Chief Justice of Nigeria sends is one of equality, it's one of transparency, is one of maintaining ethical standards, and I'm sure he's totally aware of this. I'm sure he's capable of doing it. I think that when that signal is sent, then it permeates across the board. I think today the cost of providing justice is high. And the whole reform of the sector, by the way, is not just a judicial sector. It's a whole security establishment. The fact that people tend to go to police stations and complain. The fact that they don't tend to think that they can get justice at all. So what we need to be able to do is to reorientate our people. But we're not going to be able to do this by just talking the talk. It's about walking it. And so when I say that the work of the Chief Justice is cut out for him, it's because he must know what the challenges are. The fellow brothers on the court must know what the issues are, and then we must be able to drive the change. Because, by the way, our people deserve much better than they are getting today.